Hi everyone, it's Suzanne. Welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to share with you my favorite fantasy reads of 2020. In 2020, I read 91 books. 56 of those were fantasy books. Of those fantasy books, I read 11 adult fantasy books, 33 YA fantasy books, and 12 middle grade fantasy books. And I read 11 fantasy series in total. If you'd like to know more about the fantasy books I read last year, see the playlist down below titled Fantasy Newbie Series. The first series that I'm going to talk about is A Seven Realms by Cinda Williams-Chima. This was the first series that I read last year when I discovered BookTube. I got it from the library and fell in love. This story takes place in Fellsmarch, and we start to follow a thief called Han Alistair, who's trying to do anything he can to feed himself and his young sister, as well as his mother. Ironically enough, the only thing he can't sell are the silver cuffs that he's had with him since he was a kid. He doesn't understand why they're there, but he can't ever take them off. And his life gets harder when he takes a magical amulet from the High Wizard's son, Micah. Turns out the amulet belonged to a wizard king who nearly destroyed their world a millennium ago. Needless to say, the High Wizard will stop at nothing to get it back. Then we have two princesses, Mariana and Risa. And Risa's getting close to her 16th birthday, and as heir of the throne, they want to see her get married, and she wants nothing of the sort. Risa appears to be like Hanalea, who was the legendary warrior queen who destroyed the Demon King and saved the world. And of course, Hans and Risa meet, and then we follow that explosion. There were 4 books in this series. I absolutely loved it. I think it will forever hold a place in my heart simply because it was the first series that made me want to do a deep dive into fantasy. First book is The Demon King. The second one is The Exiled Queen. Then we have The Grey Wolf Throne and The Crimson Crown. Love this series. I wonder if we'll continue to hold the #1 place as the years go on, but it certainly is going to stay there for now. Cinda Williams-Chima did write another follow-up series called the Shattered Realm series with some of the same characters. It happened to have Hans and Risa's children, and it's in the same world. I didn't include it in my top 5 because although I loved the series, I wasn't overly fond of the last 2, so it doesn't belong in the top 5. #2 on my favorites list is the Davabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty, and I'm not sure this might have made it to #1 if it wasn't for the fact that the Seven Realms series definitely holds a place in my heart. Like I said, sometime in the future I'll reread that series and we'll see where it lands in my top 5, 10 favorites. But for now, this is #2, and again, it is the Davabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty. And we start off with the City of Brass. Then it's the Kingdom of Copper. Look how beautiful these books are. Ending with the Empire of Gold. I love this series so much. I knew I did want to have it in my collection. I can see myself definitely reading it again and probably again over the years. The premise of the story is we meet Nari in 18th century Cairo, and she's living on the streets, and she's kind of a hustler just trying to survive. Unknowingly, Nari ends up calling forth a magical djinn named Dara, who takes her to the magical city of Davabad, the City of Brass. When Nari gets to Davabad, she gets embroiled in all the local politics, eventually the wars that are ongoing, and we see her growth as well as learn all about the different djinn throughout. It's a beautiful series. It's so magical to read, and you can't put it down. You definitely can't put it down. This is one of the adult fantasy books that I read, and I can't wait to see what else S.A. Chakraborty writes, because this was her very first fantasy. Actually, this was her very first book, period. And she is a historian, and it certainly shows throughout this book as well. Highly recommend this one if you're at all interested in fantasy. My third favorite was an Ember and the Ash series by Sabaa Tahir. This is a YA fantasy. And I'm chuckling inside that this is on my list because when I read the very first one, I wasn't sure if this series was for me. I found it very violent. But as we went on further, the character development and the different worlds, the magical worlds, it was just amazing. Now, it's been said this was based on ancient Rome, and the Romans, of course, loved to take over the world. So there's just a lot of fighting in this book. In the first book, in Ember of the Ashes, we meet Laya, who is rebelling against the Empire because they have taken away her brother. So she makes a deal with the Resistance that if she becomes a spy for them, they will save her brother. She ends up being a servant in the Commandant's residence. The Commandant is responsible for training the special elite forces for the Empire called the Masks. And her son is one of the Masks, and his name is Elias. And Elias wants to get out of the military and far away from the Empire. Elias and Laya meet, and of course, sparks fly, they end up running from the Empire. And we meet the Nightbringer later on, who is out to destroy the entire world of humans and is using the evil Commandant to do this. And the king ends up having a strike named Helene, which is the Emperor's right-hand person, in this case, usually responsible for a lot of death. But Helene grew up with Elias, and her first task is to find him and to bring him back, dead or alive. We really get to love this character as well as Laya and Elias. Again, this is the Ember and the Ashes series. I don't have matching covers for this series. This is an Ember in the Ashes, a Torch Against the Night, a Reaper at the Gates, a Sky Beyond the Storm. This just came out recently and finished off that series. The fourth series that I'm going to talk about is a middle grade fantasy series, and it is Keeper of the Lost Cities. And there are 8 books. I don't know if you can see all these. There are 8 books in this series, and then this 8.5 unlocked one. If you're a big fan and like lots of detailed information into the characters and the world and how she built the world, this is definitely the book for you. It has lots of illustrations and that sort of thing. It's kind of fun. But, oh yeah. The reason that I wanted it was because there is a 250 to 300 page novella in here that you do need to read before you read the next book in the series, which would be number 9. In the first book, we meet 12-year-old Sophie, who has been able to hear what people are thinking her entire life, which is, by the way, quite noisy. And she meets a boy named Fitz at the museum, and it turns out she is an elf, and he takes her back to the Lost Cities to protect her human family. When she gets to the Lost Cities, she, of course, has a lot to learn about the world and even about herself, and she goes to school where she meets a group of kids that quickly become her friends, and you see each of these kids in all the books, and it's really wonderful to see their relationships develop through all of the books and their character development as well. It turns out that Sophie was created purposefully by the Resistance, the Black Swan, and she has powers that get triggered, and as each new power is triggered, she has to learn to deal with those powers. And the leaders in the Lost Cities have to figure out how to deal with her because she has special abilities that nobody else has. As you continue on in the series, we also get to learn about another group called the Never Seen, who are out to take over the world. And Sophie and her friends are always trying to help end that resistance. It seems daunting to see all these books here and how big they are. However, I have to say they're very easy, fast, quick reads. I did love this series. It's a feel-good. I can't wait for the next one to come out. I'm really happy I have a copy because this is one I hope my daughter loves as much as I do when she's older. My fifth favorite fantasy series was kind of challenging to choose. And I was torn between 2 series that I'll talk about now. One was the Remnant Chronicles by Mary E. Pearson, and the other one was the Folk Heir Trilogy by Holly Black. I do have a copy here of the Remnant Trilogy. I do not have a copy of the Folk Heir Trilogy. They did recently publish an illustrated book which features one of the 2 prominent characters in the series. This is called How the King of Elfane Learned to Hate Stories. So I just thought I would put it here so I had some sort of reference to hold up. First, I'll talk about the Folk Heir trilogy by Holly Black. The first book was called The Cruel Prince. The second book was called Queen of Nothing. And the final book in the trilogy was called The Wicked King. The first book, we meet Jade, who witnesses her parents being killed. And then she and her two sisters are brought to the High Court of Fairy. Jade really wants to be accepted by Fae, but it turns out the majority of Fae despise humans. And especially Prince Carden, who is the youngest and the most wicked of the king's sons. And then you have a love-hate relationship between Carden and Jade throughout. And it's a lot of fun. It was the first time I personally read about Fae, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Now, putting that aside, this is number 5, The Remnant Chronicles by Mary E. Pearson. This takes place in the Kingdom of Morgan, and you meet Laia, who is the princess, and all the first daughters in this kingdom are born with the gift of sight. Unfortunately, Laia doesn't have the gift of sight, really, but her parents are hiding this fact, and they've arranged a marriage for her because they want allies from a nearby kingdom. Laia, of course, wants nothing to do with it, and she takes off and she goes and hides in a village far away. In this distant village, Laia meets 2 gentlemen. It turns out one of them is actually the prince she was betrothed to, that she was supposed to marry, and the other one is her assassin. And Laia feels like she's on the brink of discovering some secrets, even as she's falling in love. Can't wait to find out what happens. Oh, I know what happens. What I loved about this series was the first book introduced you to a new kingdom, but as each book progressed, the magic system got more and more complicated. For example, if I had read the details in the magical system and the world that was created in the third book when I first started out, I'm not sure how much I would have wanted to continue reading it. It would have been so foreign. But they slowly introduced that magical world building throughout. That's what I appreciate the most with this series. So if you're starting out in fantasy, this might be one that you want to start with. Now, I'm not sure how much men would appreciate the romantic aspects of the first book. I'd be curious to know, but definitely this would be one I would start with. Frankly, I'll be curious to see what my opinion is of many of these series once I've read even more fantasy. To recap, my 5 favorite fantasy series of 2020 are as follows. Number 1, The 7 Realms by Cinda Williams Chima. Number 2, The Devabud Trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty. Number 3, An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. Number 4, Keeper of the Lost Cities by Shannon Messenger. Number 5, The Remnant Chronicles by Mary E. Pearson. Those were my top 5. I'd love to hear what some of your favorite reads were from 2020. Please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to know. And I will see you soon with another bookish video.